I just want to, say hello and introduce you a little bit. Um, I met your husband first. I drove to New York last year and met Dr. Richard Brown. And so it was a real pleasure for me to meet the other half of the authors of the book, The Healing Power of Breath, which is on my practitioner's required list, required reading list. And so you are an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the New York Medical College, and Richard is a professor, assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at Columbia University College of Medicine,
He's an
and
associate professor.
associate
One night.
professor. Thank you. And you guys were actually, I met you at this Kripalu Science to Samadhi conference. And it occurred to me that you two are like a living example of that meeting of science and samadhi, because you are seriously clinically, scientifically oriented. I mean, as is Richard, but he also has a lifetime, he's deeply spiritual and is into martial arts and meditation and that whole world. So you guys bring together the theme of that conference that I met you at. I thought that was really great. And I know there's a few things I want to talk about. There's a couple of things I just want to say quickly. I wish we had more time. But you've done studies on the effects of yoga and schizophrenia, and you both promote non-drug treatments for ADHD and other issues and challenges, which is one of the reasons I love you. I'm an American yogi, and I'm very anti-drug and anti-big pharma. I mean, in a crisis, okay, but as a knee-jerk answer to everything, boy, don't get me started. Anyway, you you teach a basic practice called coherent breathing, and I'm going to ask you to describe that, in a few minutes. But first, I want to get right into something that you have done a lot of research on, and it's something that's been really important for me for most of my adult life, and that is the connection between stress, the stress response system, and breathing. I actually wrote the first stress and coping program for the American Red Cross back in 1976. And it took me
Wow.
it took me 3 years to convince them that they needed it, because they had, I was working with disaster relief workers, and these people were housewives and accountants, and they'd get a call out of the blue, and they'd show up at a flood or a fire or a disaster or a catastrophe. And even if they were just handing out blankets and coffee, what they saw and what they felt, it shook them to their core. And then they had to go home and cook dinner. And no one was realizing that, hey, wait a minute, we've got to help these people. I came out of the Vietnam era, and I recognized post-traumatic stress, and I saw what happens to people when they live through these things. And so I'm really interested in the connection that you've made between the stress response system and breathing. It's something people have intuitively known forever, but I guess thanks to you and some other researchers, it seems that science can now back up that connection. So 40 years ago, I felt like a voice in the desert. But now we have amazing people like you who can actually explain the scientific link between controlling your breathing or practicing certain breathing exercises and the effect on stress. So how can we take advantage of that link? What can you tell us about that specific issue?
Well, just let me preface this by saying that unlike my husband, I did not have a lifelong history of yoga and breathing and martial arts practices. I had a very traditional medical training at Harvard Medical School and did all my psychiatry residency. I even have a degree in psychoanalysis from the Boston Psychoanalytic. How much more traditional can you get?
Wow.
Yes. So,
And he managed to reach you in the middle of that field. That's amazing.
well, the thing was, was recovering from an illness, and he said, if you do these breathing practices, it'll help your physical health. That's how he coaxed me into trying the breathing. And we actually hosted our first breathing workshop at our home. And I was literally blown away by the effects of the breathing practices, not only on myself, but on the people around us in the group who were our friends and colleagues and psychiatrists and so forth who had joined us in this. And right then I knew that there had to be some way to understand these very powerful effects in terms of our modern science. Because, one thing you learn when you become a seasoned clinician, and I've been a clinician in practice for over 35 years, seeing patients all the time, is what you learn is to observe and believe and listen to your patients. And by that, then you learn tremendously over the years. So seeing is believing for me, and I saw with my own eyes and heard with my own ears these amazing experiences that people who I knew quite well were describing. We're not talking about hysterics and, people who imagine a lot of things. These were very serious people. So that sort of began our quest to understand how we could explain this scientifically, but also we thought, if we understand from a scientific point of view how these practices work, we might be able to then use the science to further improve the practices and make them even more effective in working with our patients. So it was both. And so that was now over 15 years ago. I started off reading everything I could get my hands on in the literature about yoga and mental health. And then I went into the respiratory literature. And I've probably read more studies about respiratory physiology than any other psychiatrist in the planet. I say this without reservation. They're very boring, but I learned a lot and began to make connections between respiratory physiology and effects we were seeing. And what really made the connection for us was discovering a paper by Steve Porges in 2001 in which he outlined his polyvagal theory based on his brilliant neuroanatomical studies. He discovered that, in fact, the vagus nerves have both what are called efferent pathways, which mean they send messages from the brain down to the body. The vagus nerves regulate all of the internal organs. And 80% of the fibers inside the vagus nerves, and this is something we did not know when I went to medical school, 80% of those fibers are actually carrying messages from the body up to the brain, so that the brain will know every millisecond what's happening in every corner inside the body. And thereby that information from the body is used by the brain. And this is all something we're not consciously aware of. It's going on all the time. And all this information from the body determines how we look at the world, how we understand things, the decisions, the judgments. It affects our relationships, our emotional states, and all kinds of functions in the brain are affected because these pathways go up through various relay stations and then branch out to all the major regulatory centers of the brain, including the higher centers where more advanced processes are occurring. So coming to understand this part of the system, we then began to think about, well, okay, so the brain's getting a gazillion messages every millisecond from the body. How does it know which ones to pay attention to? Which ones are having effects on it? Well, how can you figure that out? The other interesting thing is that the autonomic nervous system, which regulates all the automatic functions of the body, we know, and it is the main aspect of the stress response system, has two branches, the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch. When we're under stress or challenge or we have to do something, the sympathetic branch goes into action, speeds up our heart, our respirations, gets us ready to fight or run away if we have to escape a situation. Now, when the danger's past, what's supposed to happen is that system's supposed to quiet down. And the other half of the system, the parasympathetic system, is to come online and begin to counteract all the effects. In other words, when the sympathetic system speeds up the heart, the parasympathetic system will then slow down the heart. And the same thing, the sympathetic system speeds up the respirations, the parasympathetic slows it. But what we didn't know before was that's only a tiny bit of what the parasympathetic system actually is doing. The parasympathetic system actually regulates how we are metabolizing energy. And so when it comes online, it restores our energy reserves. It also activates the anti-inflammatory pathways throughout the body. So this will counteract all the adverse effects, because when we go into high gear, when we're fighting or running away, whenever that sympathetic system is turned on, we need it to do that for emergencies, but it burns a tremendous amount of energy. And when you burn a lot of energy in cells, you produce a huge amount of free radicals as a byproduct. And those free radicals are constantly damaging the cellular structures, the membranes, and so if that goes on unabated, your body has a lot of natural reparative capacity. But if that sympathetic overdrive goes on for too long and you keep producing those free radicals, your reparative systems won't keep up with the damage. And that is one of the main basis for the progression of most of the diseases of our modern age.
It's all that wear and tear on the system of the constant sympathetic stress happening.
Exactly. Wow. So it's very important to calm down that system and to bring on the reparative part of the system to reduce the inflammation that was caused, to help, because this restoration of energy is also important because the cells need energy to fuel their repair system. So running on low in the energy department, your cells can't keep up in repairing themselves. They just don't have enough energy.
So breath control or conscious breathing is a way to start to turn the tides, turn the switch, yeah?
Well, what we found, which was really fascinating, is that just like all the other tissues of the body, there are millions of receptors inside the lungs that are sending messages up to the brain through the vagus nerves. Okay, the vagus nerves, for anyone who might not know, are two large nerves that come out of the brainstem, and they go down the neck into the chest cavity. They branch out into all the organs, including into the heart and the lungs, go down through the diaphragm, and then innervate the entire abdominal cavity, all the organs and tissues. Okay? So
it's like a super highway of nerve.
Exactly. So what happens is when we breathe, inside all those little air sacs, those little alveoli in the air, in the lungs, of which there are millions, there are 3 different kinds of stretch receptors inside each one. So every time you breathe in and that little alveolus opens, you're triggering the stretch receptors. And they pick up how fast it's opening, how wide it's opening, every detail of every alveolus throughout your lungs. All of this information is going through the nerves that then connect, like the branches of a tree. If you think about an upside down tree, all these fine branches are carrying all of these messages from all of these alveoli up through, connecting to the vagus nerve roots, like the trunk of a tree. And it goes right up through the brainstem and into the brain. So we're getting a huge amount of information all the time from our lungs every time we breathe in and every time we breathe out. Now, of course, what we realized was that if you change the pattern of your breathing, you're going to change the pattern of all these messages that are going to the brain. And when you breathe in different patterns, that's telling the brain different things about your body and about what it should do or not do, okay? So, for example, someone did a really great experiment where they took a bunch of actors and they had them breathe at different rates. And they found that when you change the pattern or rate of breathing, you can actually have an effect on the emotions that are created. You can have like a 40% change in your emotional state, at least with these actors. Now, what we've done is we've studied hundreds of different breathing techniques, and we've identified a few that have a very major impact on how the brain is functioning very quickly. And the one that we've chosen is, we call it coherent breathing. And all that it is breathing very gently, not with any force, at a rate somewhere between 4.5 and 6 breaths per minute, depending on the individual variation, with equal inhale and equal exhale. Now, the reasons for this are that when you breathe in, you activate the sympathetic system. And when you breathe out, you activate the parasympathetic system. Okay. How do we know what we're activating? There's a way that is now possible to actually measure the level or change of level of activity of the two parts of the system based on the heart rhythm, which you can pick up with an electrocardiogram. And this is how the scientific studies are done. They measure, they follow the electrocardiogram, they do something, and then they see how that changes, and then they do a fancy mathematical calculation, and they come up with this thing called heart rate variability.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay? Because that's based on the fact that whenever you breathe in, your heart rate actually speeds up a bit. And when you breathe out, your heart rate slows down a bit. That's called normal sinus arrhythmia.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on how much more rapidly it speeds up or slows down when you breathe, these subtle things are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And so you can calculate the level of activity based on, it's a little complicated, but basically heart rate variability tells us that when you have more sympathetic drive, your heart rate variability is lower. And when you have more parasympathetic drive, your heart rate variability is greater. And a higher level of heart rate variability has been correlated with all kinds of positive health parameters.
Yep.
Okay. It also means that if you increase your heart rate variability, it means your whole cardiovascular system and your stress response system are operating in a much more flexible, adaptive way rather than in a narrow, rigid range, which is a sympathetic way of functioning.
Right.
So this is a lot of aspects to this. I'm trying to kind of get it all in here. But we then said, well, okay, say we change our pattern of breathing in a way that will optimize heart rate variability. Easy to do. You have someone breathe at different rates, and then you see what happens to the heart rate variability. So if someone, say, take an adult male like you, we just measure your breathing and we put on a cardiogram and we measure your heart rate variability. What we would find is that on average, you have probably about a 4 beat per minute difference between when you inhale and when you exhale. Okay. Now, if I got you to slow your breathing down, say to 7.5 breaths a minute, then that heart rate variability would increase maybe to 10 or 15, and that would be better. But if I got you to breathe at 5 breaths per minute, we'd see an enormous heart rate variability with maybe 35 to 40 beat difference between breathing and breathing out. And that would mean that your heart rate variability pattern resembles that would be produced by a toddler or a young child who had a very flexible, healthy system.
It shows that the heart is adjusting moment to moment. It's adapting. It's a sign of a very healthy heart. That it's
Exactly.
the old idea, a good steady pulse. Actually, we don't want a steady pulse, right?
No, not in that sense. Not
Yeah,
too
yeah.
steady. Yeah.
Well, good. It's one of the things that's striking me is that
Yeah.
you mentioned it kind of quickly that you saw and you heard, your friends and other people about these benefits, but it seems a big part of it was you also felt it in your own body, which is a
Oh,
really
definitely.
powerful motivator for people. And
Right.
you also reminded me. One of my colleagues is Dr. Peter Litchfield, the School of Applied Breathing Science, and he. I interviewed him a while ago, and he pointed out that a lot of psychiatric disorders and physiological disorders are actually misdiagnosed. They're actually breathing problems. And they kind of the breathing problem kind of goes under the radar, and a lot of people aren't making the connection between these physiological problems or psychological, emotional problems and habitual breathing patterns or dysfunctional breathing reactions. So by studying the breathing patterns and correlating that to various states, we can begin to make some really important connections, and you can actually prescribe, like you just did, you can prescribe a breathing exercise instead of a drug. I think that's fantastic, you know?
Well, one of the things that we found was that as we worked more and more with the coherent breathing, and of course we've added enhancements to that, but the core is the coherent breathing. It had a couple of very, very important effects. The first thing was it reduced the sympathetic overactivity,
Mm-hmm.
and it boosted the parasympathetic activity. Now, most of the medications that we use, and we both still write plenty of prescriptions because there are people with psychological conditions that need them.
Yep.
Okay. But the medicines that we have used in the past for anxiety, all of the anti-anxiety meds and many of the antidepressants, basically they dampen the sympathetic system, but none of them was designed to boost the parasympathetic system. So even if you do this, you've still got some degree of imbalance. And so what the breathing does is both sides of the equation. It reduces the sympathetic overdrive and it boosts up the parasympathetic side of the equation. I have to keep my hands or they'll look like that. So what this does then is fascinating, and again, this is more work by Steve Porges and his wife, Sue Carter, who's like the world expert on oxytocin and bonding, is that some of these pathways go right into the limbic system and quiet down the emotional overreactivity that occurs in people who have anxiety, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. It really quiets the overreactive emotional component. And in addition to that, branches that go up to the prefrontal cortex and the insular cortex and the thalamus, that's the fear circuit in the brain. Okay. And what happens in these folks is the amygdala, where all the emotions are boiling, is overactive, and the higher centers that are supposed to control things are actually underactive. So when we do this breathing, we improve the functioning of the control centers, the reasonable part of our minds, and we quiet the overreactive, frightened, scared, traumatized part of the mind. And so the whole system becomes much more better emotionally regulated. Another thing that's fascinating is
It is, you know, and somebody who was religious about pharmacology would, when they noticed that the anti-anxiety drugs helped with one part of the autonomic system but didn't address the other, would just say, hey, why don't we mix it with another drug that brings up the other one? And so
well, there isn't a parasympathetic booster on the market that we know of. So,
thank God.
because it wasn't until 15 years ago that people even began to think about the parasympathetic system in this way. This really is new age discovery. Yeah. So,
Beautiful.
very
Thank
interesting
God.
stuff.
Hey, listen, a couple of slides. People who missed the Science of Samadhi conference at Kapalu was really wonderful. A couple of those slides really caught my attention. So one of them had to do with this formula of social engagement plus social bonding equals co-regulation. And you talked about the difference between like face-to-face interactions with mobilization versus immobilization. And you also had this beautiful model, a schema of these three zones, like danger zone, life, which is yellow, and life-threatening, which was red, and safety, which is green, and how that when you're in the yellow zone, you trigger this approach and avoid thing. When you're in the life-threatening red zone, you freeze. When you're in the safety zone, you're flexible and adaptive. And I know that's a lot to kind of maybe summarize, but can you say something about that? Because it got me, at the time, it got me thinking about people who breathe together, who mirror each other's breath, who breathe in the same rhythm. They bond in a way that is really, to me, it's really intimate and amazing and really deep and real bonding occurs through simply two people simply breathing together. And I realized when I was in the military that a lot of, like, if you have a 50 guys who all shout yes sir at the same time, they just all exhaled together. And
Right.
people who pray together out loud and they're praying in the same words, they're getting into the same breathing rhythm. And that maybe that accounts for a lot of the social bonding that occurs in those groups because they were breathing together. So that's why I was excited about those two particular slides. And I don't know how well I did in describing them. People probably have no clue, but maybe you can bring that together into something that makes sense for people.
Well, yeah, I'm impressed at how well you remember. That was a very complicated piece of
I
slide.
had to
But
study it because it really struck me. Yeah.
yeah, no, you did really well. But let's just say this, and I really got this concept when we actually had the opportunity to invite Dr. Porges and his wife, Dr. Carter, to join us for a symposium at the American Psychiatric Association last May. And by preparing for this and rereading and discussing it with him, he actually came up, part of his presentation was the red, yellow, and green. So I then took that model and then added to it the pieces of our work. So, and he was very happy with what we did, and we're very happy with what he's doing. So we're now working more closely together because it turned out we were really both going in the same direction. But just to summarize a little bit of that, what it's about is that when we're feeling safe, and it's really all about, because our lives are about whether we feel safe or unsafe, whether we're thinking about it or not. Those are the two. We're either feeling safe, comfortable, at peace, or we're not feeling safe. We're worried about something we have to do, something we're worrying about, whatever. And those are two different ways of being that we're used to. Now, most of us do not spend a lot of time feeling like our lives are in danger. However, there are people who do, people who've been in combat, people who have had childhood abuse. They go through their whole life never feeling safe, because that feeling of never being safe, of always having to be on your guard, of never knowing what unexpected, awful thing is going to threaten your existence, stays with them. And that's where they live. They never feel safe. And that's a big part of the burden of those illnesses. So when we feel safe, we have a balanced sympathetic and parasympathetic system. We have a good heart rate variability. We're able to trust people. We're able to relate to people, to feel close, to love, all of these good things. And our mind is working well because we're not being crippled by anxieties and fears and worries. So our mind is free. And all of our activities, whether it's sports or arts or performance or working on a test in school, or everything we do kind of flows. We're in the flow. That's the green zone where we all want to be, okay? But life happens. Things happen that make us worry or stress us. And when that happens, it shifts us into what we call the yellow zone, where we have more sympathetic activity, we're more revved up. Without even realizing it, we're probably breathing faster. We have things we're worried about, we're under stress, we're under pressure, and all those things affect our emotional state. And to a certain point, we become more defensive because we don't feel totally safe. We're more defensive. Our heart rate variability is lower, so we're not as healthy, and we don't feel safe. And we're not able to feel as close because you have to feel safe to feel close. And the other thing which you mentioned was that when you're really totally safe and feel totally loved by the other person, you can be completely relaxed and still with them. And I showed some pictures of animals, like a baby koala with its mother. And you could just see that baby's just, the mom's holding it and it's completely limp. It's totally still. That's what babies are like when you hold them. They're totally safe. And that's also how you have to be for when you are being intimate and close with someone, not during the active sex part, but the rest. You need to be able to lie in someone's arms. You have to feel safe and be still with them.
That's that
Okay?
mobilization,
That's
immobilization piece, right?
this when you feel you're able to feel immobilized and there's no fear.
Uh-huh.
Okay? And that's heaven. That's bliss. Okay? That's ultimate closeness with another person. Now, what happens is that when we have to deal with things or there's stress or worry or challenge, we don't have that. We have to be ready to be active. We can't be still. Okay, we have to be ready to move. That's a whole different state. So we're now in a more sympathetic state. Okay, and we are ready to either go do something or get away from something and so forth. We're very focused on what we have to do, and we're burning more energy, yes, and we're producing more free radicals, but we're taking care of business, which we have to do. Now, when that state becomes too high, which is common in our lives because our world is very high speed, there's a lot of stimulation, there are a lot of different demands, we're all multitasking. All of this is keeping our system revved up. Now, we're not terrified, we're not feeling in danger of our lives, but simply because of all of this activity and demand, and maybe we're worried about our job, or we're worried about our teenage kid, or we're worried about our aging parent, or whatever it is, we have a lot of responsibilities and worries. And they all feed into this kind of not feeling totally safe. You don't feel like you can really just chill because you have so much on your mind and so much to do. Okay. So we're not really as closely socially engaged. I mean, we can talk to each other, but we're not really feeling close and cuddly in those times. Okay. And, we tend to be less flexible. We tend to make more snap judgments. We don't function as well overall. That's the yellow zone. Now, what happens is if there is a life-threatening event, a flood, a disaster, a terrorist attack, somebody with a gun in a school, even seeing it on television, just imagining it, okay? Or if we think that we're in danger, we're afraid of someone, there's a bully, we have an abusive partner, whatever it is, that's going to shift us now into the zone, the danger zone, where it's red, where we are afraid that we may be destroyed either physically or we might be destroyed psychologically by severe emotional abuse. Okay. And so what happens in the system then is that our system defaults. Okay, so the normal sympathetic part of the system that's able to cope with all these stresses is unable to cope with this overwhelming, terrifying threat. And we default to a lower level of functioning in which we can become paralyzed with fear, immobilization with fear, completely different from immobilization without fear.
Without fear, right?
And in that state, that's when people tend to experience things like dissociate, or it's a way to escape an intolerable situation in the mind. Okay? And so our experiences become very fragmented, and the memory becomes very disrupted, and so on. And then when we come out of that state, we may have residues from that. We may have flashbacks or other things that keep throwing us back whenever we're triggered into that state of mind. Now, what we're trying to do with the breathing practices is we're trying to keep people, teach them how to put themselves in the green zone and how to stay there. Okay, so if things are happening that move us into the yellow zone where we're having a lot of stress and a lot of worry and it's getting more and more uptight and tense and we're not being close to people, we can stop and we can do this coherent breathing. It takes about 20 minutes, sometimes less, and it will move us back into the green zone. And what we hope is it will prevent us from defaulting into the red zone. So that's kind of with that model what we're thinking about.
Wow, beautiful. That's it's this is all like feeding into a study that I've been doing personally for a long time, and a couple of the core techniques that I teach everyone. And so, for example, the sigh of relief. I talk a lot about the sigh of relief, and I talk about it in this way: that when you're in pain or when you're in fear, the breathing gets locked up, it gets jammed up. And so when the pain passes or when the fear passes, what happens is it's like you don't make it happen, you don't do it. It's a natural response when we go from a pain or fear state to a no pain or no fear state. The breathing expresses and reflects that change in the state. So I just said, well, why not turn it around? Why not
Exactly.
practice sighs of relief and start to send your system? It's like the system almost has no choice. If you send that message, that lizard brain that is monitoring every breath we take, and if it's you start feeding it sigh of relief after sigh of relief, it has to begin to think, hey, I must feel really good. I must be very safe. I should relax, you know? And so, and I've profound results from that. No, I haven't, done any scientific studies, but 100,000 people in 40 years, I don't have the luxury of doubt that if people just practice sighs of relief for no reason at all, they can actually access them in moments when it would be the most difficult thing to do. But if they can do it, it gives them a moment of a space where they actually have a choice. They're getting a handle on something that could just accelerate and turn into a major thing. They can kind of catch it early. And we're training Navy SEALs and Army Rangers and warriors and martial artists to kind of really use that. And the other is yawning. I've been trying to follow the studies on yawning. And the most recent one I read was that sociopaths don't share this tendency to yawn when other people yawn. It's connected to empathy, this part of the brain, and so on. And it seems like those two things, yawning and sighs of relief, which is something I teach absolutely everybody at every seminar. I don't let them escape without hearing about it and making them practice, because I think there's something there if we could dig into it more. Someone like you could dig into it more and explain it so that people would have a rational reason for doing it.
I can
Because right now, I just have to
tell
cajole or
you.
seduce them or
No,
somehow,
no,
find some way to get them to practice.
I
And,
can't give you total answer, but I can shed some light on that.
ooh, good.
Because it turns out when you sigh, okay, what are you doing? It's a long exhale. And when you breathe out and a long exhale, you're activating the parasympathetic system.
Mhm.
And secondly, when you make a sound, ah, right, you're doing several things. There are a lot of parasympathetic receptor fibers in the throat. And when you make a vibratory sound, you're further stimulating the parasympathetic system. Okay?
Ah.
So, and the other thing you're doing when you make the sound is you have to contract your vocal cords,
Mm-hmm.
which creates a slight resistance
Yep.
to the flow of the air. And that's whenever we sing, chant, speak, whatever. We're doing that. And when you create a slight resistance to the outflow of air, the lungs sense that. And that's an additional parasympathetic activator. So when I said we had enhancements, what we do is we start with the coherent breathing rate, and then we teach people what we call resistance breathing, where there are many kinds of it. All you have to do is create a slight resistance to the outflow of air.
Uh-huh.
You can do that using ocean breath or ujjayi breath or noisy
Ujjayi
breath.
breath, right? Yep.
It's the same thing. You're
Darth
stimulating.
Vader breath.
Exactly. You're adding additional parasympathetic stimulation.
Uh-huh.
Or you can do it with pursed lips, but I'm not crazy about pursed lips because I don't like any tension in the face. The more you can relax all your muscles, the better this is going to be. Any muscle tension is going to be sympathetic.
Yeah, that's a
And
big
so,
piece, isn't it? The
yeah,
relaxing of the muscles at the same time as the releasing of the breath. That's another thing that I train, adamantly people in. Part of the sigh of the relief is the very first moment of it where you kind of snap it loose, you let it go, and in that same moment you're letting go of the breath, you're deliberately letting go of some muscles for a moment. And
right.
you're adding when the muscles relax, I'm sure that the brain says, "Oh, I must be safe. Look at how relaxed I am." So,
So
linking
we
that
start.
conscious relaxation of the muscles
So
to the sigh of relief turbocharges it, I think.
so we start. Actually, we do two deep, relaxing breaths with a sigh,
Uh-huh.
and then we do the coherent breath. Because it's nice to get rid of some of that physical tension before you start the breathing. Because some people have so much tension that it's constricting their expansion into the breath.
Yeah.
And the other thing, when you think about it, we wanted to have a kind of breathing that people could do anywhere, anytime, regardless of the situation, without anyone knowing they're doing it. Now, you can't keep going, I mean, someone's going to notice, right? No. So
Yep,
we
that's
have
right.
people first learn to do coherent breathing with their eyes closed and to practice 20 minutes every day for a month or two. And then begin to also do it with their eyes open as they're puttering around the house. We have them get a soundtrack with a little chime to time the breathing. You breathe in on one and out on the other, and breathing through the nose, which actually is more parasympathetically activating if they don't have a stuffed nose. But anyway, to breathe very gently, not making any sounds at all, just breathing through the nose normally like you would, but at a different rate, at 5 breaths per minute, while you putter around the house, or whatever, fold the laundry. And then you can do it when you're sitting, commuting on a bus or train, whatever, and practice doing it so that you can do it under any circumstance. You can do it in the middle of the most contentious meeting at work, or even while you're working, and no one knows you're doing it. And you're just sitting there, calm in your green zone, and craziness is going on around you. Okay, so it's totally private. You
And
can
and it affects other people. You're like a secret agent because when one person in a room really calms down, not just sit still and be quiet, but on the inside, they actually experience peace. Other people feel that and they
that's right.
react unconsciously. They relax more, they become more comfortable. So having a conscious breather in the room is like really useful.
Yes,
I'm
definitely.
trying to get one in every room in the world right now, or at least in every corporation or every emergency room. Or, there's another aspect to this, and that's that people who are already extremely activated, right? So your heart rate is 175 beats, you're through the roof, bombs are going, things are, it's just total chaos. To try to control your breathing and slow your breathing down to 6, that's almost impossible. So what we do is we have them do continuous breathing. It's kind of like jumping on that runaway stagecoach like you see in those old Western movies. The guy rides up on the side on his horse, he jumps onto the horses, he comes up to speed of the getaway, the runaway system, and then he gradually brings control to it. So we're teaching that the continuous breathing, which looks like hyperventilation, but if you're in a really excited state, you kind of need to be hyperventilating because so much is happening, and then you can gradually get a handle on it, because sometimes to just try to confront this intense activation with slow controlled breathing, oh, good luck.
Uh, well, what if you start at what their breath rate is at the time? In other words, if they're breathing at 100 breaths per minute, just where they are, start there, and then have them consciously notch it down.
Well, because in those moments they're trying to control themselves, which is good, but what they're doing is holding their breath. And it's getting in the way. They need to breathe. They don't need to be holding their breath in that moment. So we actually try to get them to breathe even more to kind of, match the energy of the situation in a way. So
And
that's
then,
one of the so the two, we do two of the things. Continuous breathing is one of them. It's like a wheel of breath, no pauses or gap. Well, you know about the rebirthing techniques, no pauses or gaps between the breaths, connected, smooth, continuous. It's like a wheel of breath. That pattern and the sigh of relief, we found, are the two breathing responses or patterns that are most difficult to access in those times of extreme panic or stress and intensity. So what we do is we train people in those two patterns so that when they if they end up in one of those situations, they can actually manage to find it and use it in those moments. But they have to train ahead of time. Otherwise, they just can't get to it in those
Well,
moments.
here's the thing. Here's the thing. That's the same with coherent breathing. In other words, coherent breathing is also cyclic breathing. There's no pause between the in-breath and the out-breath.
Exactly, right. It is
Now,
continuous
and the
breathing.
training is important because that's why we have people practice it every day. So if you had your guys practice coherent breathing every day, then what happens is as soon as there's a danger, they will automatically go into coherent breathing.
In fact, the breathing will go there by itself because you've trained it. It's like
That's
the
right.
breathing itself it becomes a
Now, the
response in
other
the
thing,
system, like a very resourceful response. It replaces breath holding, hyperventilation. And the body really learns it and will turn to it in those moments by
well,
itself.
the other thing you need to know is that when you're breathing at 5 breaths per minute, okay, you would think that when you breathe more slowly, your mind slows down. But in fact, at 5 breaths per minute, your mind is operating optimally. In other words, you are clearer, your reflexes are better, and your coordination is better. So if you're a sharpshooter, you take your guys who are sharpshooters, have them train at coherent breathing for a month or two, and then their scores with sharpshooting will improve. Okay,
No
so
doubt.
these are all aspects. So that's why they really do need to train in advance, not when they're in the situation. Try it with some of you guys, really get them good with the coherent breathing so they can do it anywhere with their eyes open. They practice it. You know, when people are in the military, there's a lot of waiting, right? You hurry up and then you wait. Well, what we say is while you're waiting, do your coherent breathing.
There you go.
Practice it, get it in your system.
Thanks
And then
to
when you need it, it's there.
It's there, yeah. Well, thanks to the heart math people, a lot of the military guys are already kind of,
Yeah,
they're up to, they get it, they really get it. And
they're
but
in
here's
this.
the question. So, we say 5 breaths, but what about 6? What about 5.5? I mean, is it really that? We used to talk about a therapeutic zone.
Right.
Hey, between
I know.
4 and 8 breaths a minute. If you can just get in that zone,
That's
you'll be okay.
the reason we use 5 breaths per minute is because it's kind of the middle, the average, and that way everybody can listen to the same soundtrack.
Aha, yeah,
Play a
okay.
chime at 5 breaths per minute for a group of 300, 400 people, which military guys, we did that at Fort Drum. We had 340 guys in a room, and they all went at 5 breaths per minute. We're not going to fine tune each one, and it's not necessary because you get the effect if you're in the zone. Now, there are some differences between 5 and 6 breaths per minute, which are very interesting. There's a cardiologist in Italy. He studies 6 breaths per minute because from a cardiologist's point of view, and he's interested especially in high altitude conditions and things like that, what happens at 6 breaths per minute, it's a little bit more activating, but the fine capillaries in the hands open up more. So you get an increase in the peripheral circulation, which if you're going to climb Mount Everest is a very useful thing.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
But the other thing about the 5 to 6 breaths per minute is it increases the lung capacity so that when you inhale, you're getting much more oxygen exchange than you would normally have when you breathe at 5 breaths per minute. And so when he took his trained professional athletes up Mount Everest, the ones who had trained for, I think he trained them 2 years at 6 breaths per minute, they got to the peak of Mount Everest without oxygen, and they were breathing at 10 breaths a minute.
Wow.
And the guys who didn't train struggled to get up there. So he actually improved the, normally we're only using maybe 30% of our potential alveolar surface of our lungs to breathe. They went up to using 70%. And that's huge.
Yeah.
That means those little alveoli, and this is not through straining, it's not through overexpanding.
Right, it's not forcing, right.
That's right. And the way I think about that, and we don't have this proven yet, but if you think about a balloon, you take a balloon and you go, poof, nothing happens, right? You blow in slowly, that balloon expands. The same, I think, because the alveoli are like teeny weeny balloons.
Yep.
You breathe into them slowly, you can open more and more of them up. Because a lot of the lungs, the alveoli don't really open when we're breathing normally.
Right.
We're only using a fraction
A
of the
small
space.
portion of them, right.
Now you have all this surface, oxygen exchanges across it. So you're going to get a huge improvement. And when you can get more oxygen with less breath, you're saving a huge amount of energy,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Much more efficient
More bang
than
for
you.
your buck.
So
Well,
all of these, there's so many things we're discovering about this.
amazing. I
It's
love it.
very exciting.
And
Whether you're
David,
interested
David O'Hare, he's up in Canada. He's also a missionary for the 6 breaths a minute. Do you know about him, David O'Hare? Yeah.
I don't think
His
I
book is,
know.
his book is called 365. He's a missionary for doing 6 breaths a minute for 5 minutes, 3 times a day. And
Yeah.
and he also has tried 5, he's tried 7, and he kind of zeroed in on the 6. And he mentioned the same thing. It was because of the peripheral circulation that he thought was really important. Wow, beautiful.
So there are many different ways to use it depending on the individual's needs and goals.
Right.
Okay. If you're a person with PTSD, you want to do a lot of 5 breaths per minute. You want to maybe do 20 minutes twice a day until you overcome your PTSD. And when it's better, then you go down to once a day. If you're someone who has a lot of stress during the day, then maybe 5 minutes whenever you start to feel yourself getting revved, couple of minutes, maybe all that you need to stay in that zone. And as we talked about, military and athletes may want to use it in different ways. So it's very adaptable. And what I like about it is that you can use this fundamentally very simple technique, and then you can adapt it very easily to so many situations. So you don't have to teach people 10 things. People think, oh, teach me more, teach me more. And we say, no, just please, just
right.
get this
And then
down.
adjust it and adapt it. Your intuition will take over.
And then we'll give you these enhancements and those enhancements and so on. But you don't have to study yoga for 3 years or be in a studio every week or anything else. Just do the breathing.
Exactly. Well, one of the things I really, when you began your talk, you pointed out, I mean, there are some breathing exercises that are very, let's call them cathartic, transformational. I mean, really, like on fire kind of breathing. And you pointed out that while you're dealing with a population that you have to kind of be careful, and we have to pick something that's safe for everyone. And that's something that I've been kind of cavalier about throughout my life, because I'm not dealing with, the therapy community or people who are really ill. I'm working with people every day. They have a certain level of health, and I am not so worried about them snapping during a cathartic breathing session. But we had a very short conversation, but I took that from you, and it really it's caused me to readjust, because I am now writing a book for Simon and Schuster, and it's going to be called Just Breathe, and I have to offer something that will be basically safe for everyone, and let them gradually work into more powerful things as they're ready, or as their health increases, or as they get their head together, or whatever's required. And so I want to just thank you personally for that, because it was a piece that I never really seriously took in. And
when someone's been doing something as long as you have, it's very easy to become so enamored of your techniques and I find this, a lot of people really aren't open to change, and they become defensive about the way they're doing it. So for you to be open to maybe changing something is very admirable, and I really respect that.
On an individual basis, when I actually end up with a person doing a session, all the rules go out the window. We just, who am I with, and what does just a few breaths do to them? And and then it becomes, then we just, I trust myself in those moments to do what we need to do, and to adjust it according to each person. So when I get right down to one, it's never been an issue that I'm making everybody, breathe. But in general, I've been preaching the transformational, cathartic kind of breath work publicly and openly. And but when you actually get right down to it, you have to meet the person where they are, and that's So, yeah,
And
thank you.
the other thing that we're finding, people often like something dramatic. Something happens, they feel something. It's they like that.
Yep.
But the truth is, you can get the same results without the drama.
Yeah.
People don't have to do any intense, rapid, or cathartic feeling type experiences. If they just do these practices over time, the same transformation occurs without the storm and drum,
And it
without
doesn't always stick. People can have this amazing, fantastic, changed my life, and then you look at them 6 months later, a year later, and it was like a peak experience. But then they went
that's right.
back to their regular thing. So the daily
So,
practice is something that I don't know. There's no way around it. To me,
well,
people have to be in it for the long run, and if you can supercharge it with time to time a big burst, wonderful. But you gotta be in it for the long run, because we're talking about making deep changes, and I think those things
exactly.
take time. It really takes time to do it.
And
So
certainly in terms of shifting the way the autonomic nervous system works, yeah, it's like retraining
yeah.
muscles, of muscle patterns. So that's the long range benefit, both for psychological and physical health.
Mhm.
But also, what I find, because I do a lot of deep therapy, more and more using simple coherent breathing and a little bit of the breath moving.
Mhm.
What I like is, you know, I find that if I have to do less, it allows the patient to do
Do
more.
more. Yeah.
So, in other words, I will give them the breathing and then I'll let them do it. And I'll let them, because I'm not always talking to them and telling them, do this, do that. They will, from inside, discover things. They'll feel things they never felt before. They'll notice changes in their thoughts, in the way they experience their bodies, and all kinds of patterns that they were stuck in
Mhm.
will, with that awareness, when they're feeling quiet and safe and they're breathing in that pattern, that awareness brings about an incredible transformation
It,
within them at a deep
yep.
level, and it happens and
It's
it stays.
very empowering, isn't it? I mean, if a person breathes on their own and they have an amazing experience, they have no one to blame but themselves. It's really, you know,
It's not good. It's they're empowered. And the other thing
yeah.
is that, we're talking about people feeling safe. Well, how can you feel safe if you have the sense that some powerful person is manipulating you and making you do things? You say, this
Yeah.
way, it's quiet, and I'm in a more supportive holding role. Winnicott, the holding environment,
Mm-hmm.
where, and maybe because I've got 3 kids and I love being a mom, it's to provide a safe, secure environment where they know I'm not going to intrude on them, I'm not going to go at them, I'm not going to do anything, I'm just there. Support, a little guidance,
Mm.
just as much as you need, and you keep the breathing, and then you tell me what you're
Right.
experiencing, and then we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
And
Wow. So
once
important,
we
isn't it?
decide, that's the
Yeah.
that's the
And on the other side of it, there are times when, damn it, we don't have a few hours, we don't have a few weeks. You need to shift right now, buddy. You need to
well,
like
that's
bang, And
right.
and speaking of time, God, you have given me much more than the 30 minutes that you promised me. And everyone who's